If an early Christian went into a time machine and visited your church today, would he feel at home or would he be shocked at what he's seeing? What did early churches look like? That's the question we're going to be talking about today, specifically focusing on, in this video, on the 4th through 6th century churches. Let's get into it. So the 4th century is unique in all the centuries of Christianity because it saw the lives of so many great fathers, big names that you probably know: St. Athanasius, St. Basil, St. John Chrysostom, St. Gregory the Theologian, St. Augustine, St. Jerome, St. Ambrose, okay, St. Hilary of Poitiers, the First Council of Nicaea. All of these were during the 4th century. It was a theological gold mine. In fact, it's called by some people the golden age of the fathers. It was also a watershed moment for the church because Christians had a newfound religious freedom thanks to Emperor Constantine. So during this time, Christians for the first time could express their faith in the way that they wanted to express it. And there were many more Christians at this time to accommodate than before because the new freedom of religion that they had gave rise to a boom in the number of Christians in the empire. So there was an exponential growth of Christians at this time. They needed bigger churches, and their freedom of expressing their faith led to more richly decorated churches. So with the 4th century came some new architectural and iconographic traditions, and perhaps other new expressions of the faith. Some people think incense started to be used liturgically at this time. Vestments may have undergone changes at this time. Development in their love of the saints, their expression of veneration of the saints, developed at this time. So just different areas where the 4th century might have seen some development in the practices of the early church. It's also a unique time because it predates later schisms. So think the Chalcedonian Schism, the Oriental Orthodox like the Coptics, the Ethiopian Orthodox, the Syriac Orthodox. All of those were united with the Orthodox and the Catholics at this time because it predates the schism where they broke apart. This also predates the Great Schism. So Catholics and Orthodox, Rome and Constantinople, the whole West and East were all united under one church at this time, and it of course predates the Protestant Reformation. So this is significant. It means that Orthodox, Catholics, Oriental Orthodox, and Protestants all share a common heritage in the 4th century church. So the 4th century has the church fathers who are all of our fathers as Christians. This is our heritage as Christians, regardless of which denomination you belong to. And I think that's very interesting because when you're looking at 4th century churches, you're not looking at some other denomination's church. You're actually looking at your own ecclesiastical heritage as a Christian. Another reason why the 4th century church is unique is because we have so much information about it compared to what we have from the 3rd century, 2nd century, and 1st century. We have a lot of archaeological evidence and extant churches. There are churches still standing today which were built in the 4th century. We have floors and liturgical tools. We even have Bibles from this time which still exist today. We have mosaics like those at Ravenna, which date to the 6th century, but they give insight into the 4th century church. And then we have historians like Eusebius, who in The Life of Constantine describes churches that were built during the 4th century. We have the Apostolic Constitutions, which was a written work written between the 2nd and 4th century. And it describes a whole church service with its liturgical prayers and practices. And it reports about vestments and censing with incense, priest blessing, signs of the cross, Eucharist, singing hymns to saints, all very detailed practices from the early church, so we can see exactly what was going on in the churches at this time. And it even describes the church layout and what that meant to early Christians. So what did the church look like in the 4th century, and maybe a little bit in the 5th, 6th century as well? What did the buildings look like is something we'll be talking about, as in their shape, their layout, their decoration, but also I'll be talking a little bit about the vestments that they were wearing, the liturgical tools they were using. So in the 4th century, the church began using basilica architecture. Okay, so basilica architecture was a part of secular Roman society. Before they were used as churches, basilicas served as public buildings. And this is pretty significant because it means that the origin of basilica churches is not pagan temples. So it might be tempting to think, oh, okay, well, there was a sort of merging of paganism and Christianity at this time. Well, not really. They actually used a neutral architecture as the basis for basilica churches and then Christianized it. So there's no pagan roots or anything like that within the 4th century church. They were just using a neutral architecture and applying it for Christian purposes. And basilicas were rectangular shaped, and they had a central nave flanked by 2 or more longitudinal aisles. So there's columns running through the church or the basilica, and that creates 2 aisles on the side and then a long running nave in the middle. So it's just simply a rectangular building with 2 aisles is the basic definition of a basilica. So here's an example of what a pre-Christian Roman basilica might have looked like. This is a reconstruction of the interior of the Basilica Ulpia in Rome. And you can see there's no altar in here. There's no apse in here. There are no icons in here. It's just a rectangular building with some columns and some aisles. And that's essentially all that a basilica was. And it could be used for all kinds of different public purposes, like a court or something like that. Well, basilica architecture was not taken as is, but was modified for church use. So Christians added an altar which was shaped like a table at the front of the church, and it was typically on a raised area in a semicircular sanctuary. So all of these were uniquely Christian features that were added to the basilica architecture to accommodate the Christians' worship. An apse was added over the sanctuary, so this circular cutout of the wall ran all the way up, and then had sort of a spherical or semi-spherical region at the top called the apse. And this typically had an image of Christ in it, or Christ with his apostles, or Christ with Peter and Paul, like Traditio Legis, which is an icon motif from the early church. And there probably were images of biblical narrative scenes on the walls of the nave. So above the columns that are running down the church, above those were probably scenes from the Bible. And this is evidenced by later extant examples like the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome, which dates to the 5th century, and Sant'Apollionare Nuovo in Ravenna, which dates to the 6th century. Both of these have running scenes from the Bible above the columns in the nave. So these uniquely Christian features were probably continuations of earlier church traditions. I think this is really important because it means that Christians didn't just walk into a basilica and start having church. They actually took traditions with them from earlier churches, from the 1st through 3rd century church tradition, and brought it into the basilicas and conformed the basilicas to an earlier tradition. So when you're looking at a basilica church, you're not really looking at something that's 100% new. There are elements which are new, but there are also elements which are older, which go back into the apostolic times. So to give an idea of how this happened, I have a picture of a reconstructed basilica from Rome. This is a secular one. That's the Basilica Ulpia. And then a reconstructed church at Tel Megiddo in Israel. This is a 3rd century church and a reconstruction of what it may have looked like. And you can see that these both have elements that came together in this reconstruction of the old St. Peter's Basilica, which dates to the 4th century. And you can see, like that basilica, it has these long columns in a row, and it has the aisles and the long nave. But like that church in Tel Megiddo, it has that altar in the front, in that area where the clergy would gather around the altar. So it's the Basilica Church is really a merging of these two architectural churches, and it's bringing with it earlier Christian traditions, how Christians would have been practicing in their churches before the 4th century. So here's another example. This is the actual floor of Tel Megiddo from Israel. This dates to the 3rd century. And I've marked on here where you can see corresponding areas. So B is that altar towards the front of the church. And then A is the section where the bishop and the presbyters would have been sitting. And then D is the area where the laity would have been standing. And then you can see this C part. Clearly in the floor of that 3rd century, there's a distinction between these two areas of the church, the area of the altar and the area where the laity are standing. And this general format corresponds to the basilica floor plan. So they really aren't reinventing the wheel here. They're just adapting a typical Roman basilica to a Christian church layout. So in AD 324, Christians began building new churches. Okay, so not just repurposing basilicas, but actually building churches for the purpose of being a church. According to the new Basilica Church design, the first of these was St. John Lateran in Rome, which was consecrated in 324. So some others that we know of are the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the Church of the Nativity, and Old St. Peter's Basilica. There are others. And Christian basilica churches also sometimes added domes to basilica. So Romans had domes in some of their buildings, so Christians sometimes added domes to their churches, their basilica-style churches, and this would actually be really important later, especially in Byzantine churches in the future. So here's a floor plan of a basilica that dates to the 4th century. And you can see the layout of it, these columns running through it, and this long nave, and then towards the front where the altar would be, and this semicircular sanctuary. It's following a typical basilica layout. You can see this was all the way back in the 4th century using this layout for their church services. This is a possible reconstruction of the original interior of Old St. John Lateran, which dates to the 4th century. And you can see this basilica layout, but towards the front you can see the altar and this rounded sanctuary and a barrier there which divides the church into these two portions, the portion of the laity and the portion of the clergy with the altar. And then here's a reconstruction of the old St. Peter's Basilica, very similar to the previous image, but in this one you can see there's images of biblical scenes on the walls above the columns. There's images of Christ, there's that Traditio Legis image, and then in the front that semicircular sanctuary where the altar is. So this would have been what churches looked like in the 4th century. Maybe not all of them were as big and as ornate as Old St. Peter's Basilica, but they would have had the general format of this church. These would have been the basic ingredients for a 4th through 6th century church. This is a painting from an eyewitness of the church of St. Paul outside the walls. This dates to the early 5th century, AD 402, and he's depicting for us what he was seeing when this church was still standing. Unfortunately, it burned down in a fire in the 19th century, but he depicted what he was seeing, which were biblical scenes painted on the walls above the columns, and then the front of the church, that apse at the top with the image of Christ, Traditio Legis, the altar, and which is elevated, and it looks like a very typical basilica church. So again, this is what churches would have looked like in the time of St. Augustine, St. Jerome, St. Athanasius. This is what churches looked like. There's an interesting example from Greece. This has a basilica layout like the other churches in Rome, but this one has domes on it, so that's another known architectural element from the Roman times. Some of the churches incorporated those into them as well. So the church shape of having a nave and being a basilica or a rectangular shape had a meaning to it. The apostolic constitutions say, "Let the building of the church be long, with its head to the east, with its vestries on both sides at the east end, and so it will be like a ship. In the middle let the bishop's throne be placed, and on each side of him let the presbytery sit down, and let the deacons stand near at hand, in close and small girt garments, for they are like the mariners and managers of the ship. With regard to these, let the laity sit on the other side with all quietness and good order." So for the early Christians, this rectangular shape had a symbolism to it of a ship. And the ship is a well-known Christian symbol, iconographic theme of being a symbol of salvation, that those who are in the water are drowning, but those who are in the ship are being saved. So it's a really cool and interesting imagery. Just the building itself sort of gives the impression that you're in this ship of your salvation by worshiping God. It's very interesting. And what this is describing is pointed out here. We have the floor plan of a typical um, Basilica church, and it's long and rectangular. You have the aisles there, and where the laity would be standing. And then you have in the back on the other side of the altar a cathedra, or a chair where the bishop would be sitting, and some chairs where the presbyters would be sitting. So this is what it's describing. And you can see this in a church in Paros, Greece. You can see there's seating arrangements on the other side of the altar. This view is showing in front of the altar, on the opposite side of where the laity are standing. You can see there's a chair there. There's multiple chairs. And this church dates to the 4th century, and you can see the altar is there, and there's this seating where the presbyters would be sitting, and the bishop would be sitting there in the middle, who's presiding over this church. So it's an interesting format. We tend to see in our churches today and get the impression that everybody is facing towards the altar and they're all facing one direction. But it's interesting that in the earliest churches, the laity were on one side and the clergy were on the other side, kind of sitting around the altar as if it were this table, this common meal that they're sharing. And this is probably based in an earlier, even earlier practice of maybe one of the apostles or the bishop would sit on one side of the table and then the congregation would gather around it in very small house churches in the very beginning. And this could be calling back to a very, very ancient practice in the house churches from the 1st through 3rd centuries. So this is a possible reconstruction of what that might have looked like. You have the bishop sitting in a chair on one side of the table, and then the Christians in that house church are sort of gathering around the table for that meal, the Eucharistic meal. 4th century churches are also known to have ambos, which were elevated places for reading the scriptures and giving homilies. So early Christian church services started off with, in the first part of their liturgy, with reading the Bible. They read the Old Testament, they read Psalms, they read epistles, and they read the gospel in their liturgies. And this would have been done on this raised ambo that would have been closer to the people, sometimes right in the middle of the nave, because they didn't have microphones, and they would have been closer to the people there so that people can hear what they're reading. Um, the Apostolic Constitutions references this. It says, "In the middle, let the reader stand upon some high place," referring to the elevated ambo. And these were the precursors of pulpits, which did not exist at this time in the churches. Churches would have been using ambos. And you can see this ambo from the Panagia Ikaton ton Piliani in Paros, Greece. And this is a 4th century church. And this is probably the original location of the ambo, although the wood and parts of the ambo are probably restored. And then this is an ancient style ambo in a church in Greece today. And you can see it's right there in the middle of the nave. So people would be standing around this ambo. It seems a little bit strange now, but again, they didn't have microphones. So the best way to hear them would to let people hear what you're reading is to stand right in the middle of the group and read to them. So there's also something called the Ciborium, which is a sort of covering structure over the altar. Some very large churches in the 4th century had these. There was one, for example, at St. John Lateran. The Liber Pontificalis says, "In his time, Constantine Augustus built the following basilicas and adorned them, the Constantinian Basilica, where he offered the following gifts: a ciborium of hammered silver." So he's telling us about this ciborium over the altar at St. John Lateran. And this had curtains on it. So there would have been parts during the liturgy where the priest would close the curtains around the altar, and this would eventually merge with a chancel screen and become the precursor of the iconostasis, which you see in Orthodox churches today. But at this time, some of the larger churches had the ciborium. Now, so speaking of the chancel screen, 5th and 6th century Basilica churches had small walls. Sometimes they had columns on them, separating the sanctuary from the nave. These walls were probably based on a 4th century equivalent, perhaps a low wall or railing that was separating where the lay people are standing and the clergy are with the altar. And this wall was the forerunner of the later iconostases and Western rood screens. So if you go to very old churches in Europe or you go to Orthodox churches, you'll see a wall or barrier between the altar and where the people are standing. And this wall is based on this early Christian low wall or railing that separated these two areas of the church. So, in fact, some of these Orthodox and Catholic churches uh, have these exact same style walls today that the early Christians were using. So this is a reconstructed chancel screen from the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, and it's put together with pieces of chancel screens from churches around the area, and these date anywhere between the 4th and 6th century. And the website says the church Bema, reconstructed here, comprises original architectural elements excavated at 17 different sites. The pieces fit together perfectly as if they had come from the same building. So Christians were very consistent in using these chancel screens, and they, from 17 different sites, pieced them together. So this was a very typical, common element of early Christian churches, that you have the altar in the sanctuary in the front of the church with an apse above it, and then a chancel screen separating where the lay people are from where the altar is. But at this time, they would have been very short walls or had some pillars and some kind of bar at the top. And here's a reconstruction of one of these chancel screens, or sometimes called a templon, and sanctuary from the Kim Presbytery. This is from Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this dates to the 5th century. And this is an artist's reconstruction of what it might have looked like based off of the archaeological evidence there. And you can see this one has that low wall around the altar, and then this has some pillars there. And you can still see these kinds of screens in some churches in the world today, very ancient ones. This is the Church of the Holy Apostles in Athens, Greece. This church dates to the 10th century, but it has a very ancient style templon, which is a continuation of that ancient early Christian kind of templon with a low wall and some columns on it. This is the Church of St. Mary in Cosmedine, Rome. This dates to the 6th century, and again, it has that ancient early Christian style chancel screen where it's that low wall with some columns above it, and it's separating that altar area from where the lay people are standing. And this would have been a very normal, typical feature of early Christian churches. And by the way, you can see in the back there that apse with icons there. You can see that Ciborium above the altar is a very typical site. If you were to go back in time and look at an early Christian church, it probably would have looked a lot like this. So early Christian churches always had an altar, and this altar was always at the front of the church. And on the altar is where the Eucharist was consecrated. They would also place there the book of the Gospels. Altars were always square and away from the wall, so they weren't pushed back against the wall. And being away from the wall allowed clergy to move around the altar and to sit in front of it. So the bishop would have been sitting on one side and the lady would have been standing on the other side. So it would have been pulled away from the wall to allow the clergy to move and sit behind it. They were shaped like a table and had either a center leg or four legs, sometimes both center leg and four legs. The altar was also is known to be covered with a linen cloth, and this is mentioned by Saint Optatus in the 4th century. He writes, "What Christian is unaware that in celebrating the sacred mysteries, the wood of the altar is covered with a linen cloth?" So these tables would have been covered with a linen cloth. And we have some images here. This one dates to the 6th century. This is a mosaic of Abel and Melchizedek by an altar. And this altar is probably depicting a Christian altar at that time. So you can see the four legs to this table-shaped altar. And you can see that linen cloth draped over it. Here's another depiction from the 6th century. This is on a small pyxis box, and it shows a Christian altar, and you have that covering over it. There's a lamp above it with the curtains hanging there, and then on this altar you can see the Gospels book there. So vestments were also in use at this time, and they would have been distinguished from typical Roman clothing. There would have been liturgical vestments in use during the 4th through 6th centuries. And we know that because we see them in mosaics and we see them referenced in early Christian writings. So in the 4th century, bishops, presbyters, or priests, and deacons had distinct liturgical vestments. These vestments are called the sticarion, the epitrachelion, the phelonion, and the omophorion. Okay, so these would have been the 4 most common basic liturgical vestments that we see in the early Christian iconography and referenced in the early Christian writings. Now, all of these can still be seen today being worn by Orthodox priests, Catholic priests and bishops, Orthodox bishops. They're still wearing derivatives of these very same vestments today. In fact, the phelonion is referenced in the apostolic constitutions. It says, and let him, that's the bishop, put on his shining garment and stand at the altar and make the sign of the cross upon his forehead with his hand. So we have the description here of the bishop standing in front of the altar, getting his phelonion on, or his chasuble, and making the sign of the cross. So this is a clear reference to this shining garment, which might be a reference to the color of it, or could be a reference to the shininess of it. And this is a 6th century mosaic from Ravenna. You can see all of these vestments here. You can see around the bishop's neck, you have the omophorion or the pallium. Over his body, he has the chasuble, and then underneath it, the alb, and then the stole you can see poking out from underneath the chasuble that he's wearing. So all of these liturgical vestments are in place during the 6th century. They probably were in place even earlier than this. Here's a few more examples, also from mosaics from Ravenna, showing all of these things. You have the sticarion, the phelonion, and the omophorion all being depicted in these. So there was a consistency in early Christian vestments used for liturgical purposes at this time. Another thing you hear about and you see in the early Christian churches is censers with incense. So the apostolic constitutions, in its apostolic canons, this is from canon 4, says this. It says, for it is not lawful to offer anything besides these at the altar, and oil for the holy lamp, and incense in the time of divine oblation. So offering the Eucharist, a lamp, an oil lamp, and incense with a censer were all practices that would have been happening during that 4th century through 6th century church. And we have a few of these incense censers which still exist today from archaeology. This one dates to the 5th to 7th century, somewhere around that time. We have a mosaic from Ravenna that shows it's probably a deacon holding a censer with incense in it. This dates to the 6th century. And here's another example of a censer, which is probably from Egypt, and it dates to the 6th to 7th century, and it looks very similar to the one in this mosaic. So in conclusion, what did the churches of St. Athanasius, St. Jerome, St. John Chrysostom, and Eusebius look like? Well, they looked like this. They were long, rectangular buildings with columned aisles, with scenes from the Bible in iconography on the walls, leading up to an altar in the front in a semicircular sanctuary with a chancel screen. They had an altar there with the Eucharist. This is what the early church looked like, the 4th through 6th centuries. In the front of the church, dividing the sanctuary from the nave, was the chancel screen, which looked like a small wall with columns above it. There was a Ciborium over the altar in the very large churches. And in this, you can see that apse at the top, which would have had icons of Jesus, Peter, Paul, other disciples, angels. They would have worn vestments, which looked a lot like this, with a chasuble over a stole and an alb underneath it. And they would have had censers like this one in this picture, which dates to probably the 6th century or 7th century. So that's what I have for today's video. I hope that was intriguing. Does your church have these things? If not, you might want to consider visiting a church that does to kind of get some of that ancient Christian experience. I would recommend going to an Orthodox church because much of these still continue to be used in Orthodox churches. If you haven't already, please subscribe, and thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.